All right, so let's jump right into it. This conversation is only designed to stimulate the mind. It's only designed to stimulate the mind. And we're going to talk about this area here, but I drew a line across the top of the board because this was some information that I had earlier, but I wanted to leave it for this message. One of those messages was to learn the process to introduce a new world to you. Learn the process to introduce a new world to you. Do you understand there is a process? And what process is that for you to master so you can be introduced to the new world? It may not be what you consider your world, but with faith and works, all things will work for good. What creates wealth and what inhibits the creation of wealth? These are questions that you must ask yourself, and also ask yourself, what is wealth to you? Everyone has their own idea of wealth. So what is wealth and what inhibits the creation of wealth? Let's jump right into it. Today's conversation, we wanted to talk about, it was a post I was watching, a video that was based upon the origin of race in America. No right or wrong answer, but we do have to start the conversation. There was a particular area that talked about global capitalism backed by slavery and colonialism. And I felt that was so important to stop and talk about. Global capitalism backed by slavery and colonialism. First of all, you got to understand these are the outputs from the input, and here are the processes to make it happen. So the output is global capitalism. The input is slavery and colonialism, and the process is backed by these processes to ensure the output. And this came from not only an action, which was slavery and colonialism, to produce global capitalism, but it also came with an idea, because you have to understand that ideas and actions go hand in hand when it comes to producing the energy. So their idea was there's a time of enlightenment for the English society, a time of enlightenment. And again, there's no right or wrong answers. We're just throwing it out there to have an open conversation. So when it comes to global capitalism, and we're talking about just slavery, let's just get into this conversation. According to what I was doing research on slavery at this time, when it came to colonialism, which was looking to produce global capitalism, slavery, there were two kinds during colonialism. One was enslaved Africans, and the second slavery was Britain indentured servants. And when I think of these two, first with enslaved Africans, the first thing I think of are African slaves, and that's when I believe African tribes, and let me know if I'm speaking out of ignorance, African tribes went to war with one another, and I believe it was in the culture to enslave the loser, if you will. And then there was also the Arab slave trade. Again, I can't be speaking out of ignorance, but I believe those two things, when it comes to enslaved Africans, is what comes to my mind when it comes to slavery and colonialism. The second form of slavery was Britain indentured servants. And when I think of these two, enslaved Africans and Britain indentured servants, I think of the diversity of culture, because these are two different cultures. They're human beings, and when it comes to Africans and English and the British, if you will, sounds like there's a diversity of culture, which is another topic of discussion. And we want to talk about at some point the history of Africans and the history of Africans and the history of Britain enslavement, if there was any. What is the history of African slavery? What is the history of British enslavement, if there were any? That's a whole other conversation that we can talk about when it comes to enslaved Africans and comes to slavery of colonialism. This second form of slavery was Britain indentured servants. And let's first jump into the Britain indentured servants when it comes to slavery. First of all, according to what I was researching, the Britain indentured servants, they were contractual agreements with fixed terms that varied widely. So when it came to slavery and colonialism back in those days, when the slavery began in the colonies, if you will, the Britain indentured servants came to the Americas, but they came through a contractual agreement with fixed terms that varied widely. And two, they were brought to the colonies as punishment, or they were brought to the colonies as children. And so when you look at those two things of contractual agreements and people coming to the colonies as punishment or as children, keep in mind, once the term was up when it came to indentured servants, usually that servant became property owners or landowners, they became property or landowners. Now keep in mind, this is from a Britain indentured servant culture. They had contractual agreements from adults and children that once was up, they became property and landowners. One of the questions that we'll get into is, were there black indentured servants coming from Britain? And did they get those same rights, if you will, coming from the Britain culture? That's not a right or wrong answer. That's a question we can get into. Second thing we're going to talk about when it comes to slavery is enslaved Africans. Again, first thing that comes to my mind, being someone of ignorance, is African slaves warring with one another and enslaving one another in the Arab slave trade, which was naturally a business. Four things to keep in mind when it came to enslaved Africans. One, when you look at the enslaved Africans from that culture, if you will, slavery was for life, and there were no terms for fixed years. So as an indentured servant, you had certain terms and certain time to be a slave. When it came to African slavery culture, from my understanding, could be wrong, slavery was for life and not fixed terms for years. Number two, slaves were not considered humans as well. So when you look at the British indentured servant culture, they were at least considered human, because we're going to find out shortly. But in African culture, if you will, according to the colonialism time, slaves were not considered human. So I don't know if there was some type of agreement. Oh, let's see. Number three, now, when it came to enslaved Africans, there was no contract between two humans. Because if you're not considered human, then there's no need for an agreement. So there was no contract, as two human beings have to come to an agreement in order for there to be an agreement or a contract. So if you're an African slave, first of all, you're enslaved for life. You're not considered human, so therefore you can't come into any type of agreement as a human being, if you will, for your development and growth. Therefore, slave laws were then enacted, creating hereditary slavery, meaning from the African slavery culture side, when you came into the colonials, you were not only there for life, you were also not considered human. There were no agreements for you, and then there were laws, if you will, codes, if you will, put into place for you and any children that were born from you to keep that process going. So therefore, you have to look at, again, the diversity of cultures during the time when these cultures collided. And that was during the colonial times, which was backed and processed into global capitalism. And we have enslaved Africans, and we have Britain indentured servants. So there's so many other conversations we can get into. This was all, again, in my pursuit of the origin of race in America, and how much that culture and idea plays into our political, economic, and cultural lives in what we call America today. We look forward to our next conversation, and thank you for what you felt this message was worth to you by clicking the link to donate what you felt this message was worth to you. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing to all of the links. Remember, it's a new day, and we're more than just marketing.